the place to start is just making sure grading is equitable.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me means assessing students in a fair and meaningful way. It starts with understanding that students, they're all starting from different places. They have different educational experiences, cultural experiences. They come to our classes with varying language skills.
Mm-hmm.
And then beyond that, like our grading is going to be imperfect. We might come to class with some sort of bias, even a
Yeah.
bias we're not aware of, you
Mhm.
know. If you're grading an essay, for example, your grading might be uneven depending on if it's the first essay or the last essay.
Uh-huh.
If you're grading fully awake at 9 o'clock in the morning,
Mhm.
or if you're grading at 10 o'clock at night, you know.
As often
So when we
happens. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my God, yes. So as we grade, we gotta, take all these things into account.
I'm definitely guilty of grading at 10 p.m.
You gotta do what you gotta do.
Yes. And honestly, it's never my best work.
Never is. But back to the main topic here, equitable grading practices.
Yes. So this is the third episode in our little mini series on classroom assessment. In episode 31, The Beauty of Assessment, we talked about some of the key concepts of assessment design.
And in episode 33, Long Live the Rubric, we delved into how to make rubric design a more sustainable process.
But a conversation about assessment wouldn't be complete without recognizing many of the inequities that exist within assessment.
And many of the alternative forms of assessment that have come about as a solution to this issue.
So in this episode, we're speaking to our friend Albert Shaheen about his new exploration of equitable assessment practices and reframing our approach to grading.
Ready?
Set.
Reframe!
Hello and welcome to the Teacher Think-Aloud podcast, a podcast for reflective practice for teachers of English around the world. I'm your co-host, Anna.
And I'm Shey.
Let's learn about Albert.
My name's Albert Shaheen. I am a full-time ESL instructor at Mission College in Santa Clara, California. I also teach writing remotely for NeoScholar Education based in Wuhan, China. My pronouns are he, him.
Excellent, thank you. And so I have an icebreaker for you. Albert, are you a fan of Star Wars?
Kind of, here and there, nothing special.
Okay. How about, are you a fan of Harry Potter?
Fun fact, I've never seen a full Harry Potter movie.
Oh
You're
my
failing.
gosh.
This is like a backup question, too.
Let's see, are you a fan of the 90s sitcom Friends?
Oh, no.
Oh man.
Sorry.
Do you like anything? He has a newborn. How old is your daughter?
She's 17 months old.
Are you a fan of Coco Melon? No.
Well, my daughter is a fan of Coco
I'm
Melon.
just kidding.
I'll tell you a fun little thing about that.
Yeah.
So my wife's first language is Arabic, so we're trying to raise our daughter to be bilingual. And so she watches Coco Melon, but she only can watch it in Arabic.
Wow.
So that's
That's
and
awesome.
you can find Coco Melon in Arabic.
Well, we didn't exactly get what we were asking for. But I loved learning about how he's raising his daughter to be bilingual.
So sweet. And we learned that not all our icebreakers are going to work out for us.
That one flopped, yep. But fortunately, he had a lot more to say about our topic than he did about TV and movies.
Our first question for you is, what inspired you to start examining different, less traditional forms of assessment?
I have, I think, two things that inspired me. The first is just I've been teaching here for about 4 semesters, and I was questioning the meaning behind the grades that I was giving the students. Are those grades reflecting their progress? What do they mean to them? Also, in my role at Mission, a coach for something called Community of Praxis. In short, Community of Praxis is a community of colleagues that support one another in learning and growth as equity pedagogy practitioners. So looking through some of the resources we had, I came across two educators, Susan Bloom and Jessie Stomel. And Susan Bloom has a podcast, or she's on a podcast episode. It's called ungrading in the pandemic, and the rest of the time too. And I really think it's a fantastic primer if you're interested in ungrading or alternative methods of grading. In the episode, she goes through like 9 or 10 steps of ungrading. And what caught my attention was that her process really empowered students and gave them opportunities to take ownership over their learning. Goal setting, giving students choices, authentic assessment, reflection were some of the topics that were touched on. So
That community of praxis he's a part of sounds really great.
It does. And I think that question of what do these grades even mean to students, that really raises an important point. As our listeners, Heather and Etche from English as a Singing Language podcast wrote on Instagram, students will ask, will this be on the quiz?
Like that's all they care about.
Right. But as Heather and Etche note, what's more important is for them to reflect on what they'll take from the class, to be curious. In their words, what if you leave class today and hear this word or read it somewhere? Don't you want to know what it means?
Exactly. And so the primary purpose here is to center in on student learning, build that into the culture, and get them to think differently, not just fixate on the grade.
Right.
As our listener Lilith commented on Facebook, the mindset has to be changed.
Yes.
We focus too much on teaching for exams. If we as teachers model that behavior, it's only natural that our students will also focus on grades over outcomes.
Absolutely. And then we have to ask ourselves if in emphasizing the process, are we supporting all students equitably? Albert had a really good example of how traditional grading may not achieve this.
Just think about students with varied language skills, right? Here's an example. Say 2 students take a semester-long course at a community college. We'll say the students are in a B1 level writing course. In the course, students are going to have 4 to 5 writing assignments, with the last one being a 5-paragraph essay. Student A has been at the same school for 1.5 years now. So she's progressed through different levels. She's learned basic paragraph structure. She has a decent understanding of complex sentence structure. Student B comes from a different school. Her classes focus on different concepts. Maybe she's a good speaker, but she struggles with writing. Maybe she has difficulty with sentence structure and doesn't have a firm understanding of what a paragraph is. So in the first few assignments, she scores lower. But after a while, she's using the feedback she receives. She's learning the concepts taught in the course. She's growing and becoming a stronger writer. The last writing assignment for the course calls for students to utilize everything they've learned during the semester. So both student A and B do well, and they've demonstrated a mastery of all the learning outcomes in the course. So if you're grading more traditionally, student A is going to end up with the higher grade because you're going to take in all of the assessments. But at the end of the day, they've both mastered everything. So one, there's the idea that giving them the same grade sounds fair, but it's not just what's fair, but what you're communicating to them, right? So I think equitable grading, if you're using an more equitable approach, both of those students would end up with a similar grade or at least similar feedback.
Yeah, I think that there's often a misconception or sort of a conflation of the words equality and equity. And so this really speaks to the idea of considering the students that have made really major gains over the course of a semester, but also honoring that student that was already sort of at, the benchmark or whatever the starting expectation was at the beginning of the semester.
And I also, something I'm picking up on here is just how the student who maybe wasn't doing so well at the beginning, but made these really great gains. I mean, that's just incredible. That's just such an accomplishment on their part that is worth celebrating.
Absolutely. I mean, that's just an example, but it's important for them to understand what they've accomplished.
And so Albert is really highlighting here the importance of getting students to focus on the learning part of it, not so much the grades. And so ungrading is just one of these more equitable approaches to assessment he's been experimenting with. And we wanted to know more about that.
The idea of equity is so important to me. And over the years, thinking of assessment, trying to build in more equity and build in more humanity into it has been an important component for me. But so in terms of ungrading, how can I really latch on to what it is?
So first of all, I'm a novice too. I'm learning. When it comes to equitable teaching, there's a lot of things people can do. There's a lot of ways teachers can approach that. And I'd say ungrading or going gradeless is like one of those.
Going gradeless.
I
Going
like that.
gradeless, right? Yeah.
So ungrading is actually just going gradeless?
Not grading.
Going gradeless, you know?
Or grading
Amazing.
really differently, right? Without numerical scores or letter grades, right?
Yes, yeah, basically.
Okay.
And especially as you're trying different things for your classes, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. In like some of the stuff I've been reading, they talk about ungrading for an assignment or just giving students more control over the way they're evaluated. I think in general, it's an attempt to reframe the way we evaluate students, to shift the focus from grading and scoring to learning and growth.
So ungrading is essentially formative assessment.
Maybe, but you do want to assess students summatively too, I believe, because you're going to want them to demonstrate that they've mastered the goals of the course. So when you remove the numbers and letters, it changes, I think, what students ask for and what they look at. So if you think about it, when we grade students, that's what they ask about, right? Students want to know how they can get an A in the course.
Pretty much only that. Yeah.
Exactly, right? And we know this from when we were in school. What'd you get on the test? Did you get 100? Did you get an 80? So what if you remove that? Then students are still going to want to know how they did. But instead, I think it shifts the focus, forces students to ask questions like, what kind of feedback did I get? What comments did I receive?
And I wonder how the conversations between students would shift in this environment. Instead of saying, like, what score did you get, right? Or how'd you do? They might say, what did you learn? Or how was this process for you? I don't know. Maybe I'm being idealistic, but yeah, maybe we're making more reflective learners.
Well, exactly. Like, that's the goal. I don't know. I mean, at the end of the day, like, how much does a grade really matter? In the realm of teaching English to speakers of other languages, nobody's going to care when you go to your job that you got an A in your upper intermediate listening and speaking course. They're going to care that you can listen and speak, right?
Yeah.
You know? And so we're trying to shift the motivation here to be more, I think, intrinsic, be more focused on the benefits to them and that they are able to do what they want to do rather than just what the grade is. I think even like the way we talk about it when we talk to students, instead of maybe saying something like, if you don't do such an assignment, it'll affect your grade. Maybe we should say like, you know, you should complete this assignment because it will help you achieve this goal or it will help you build a skill to do this.
So to me, what I'm getting out of this is ungrading is this philosophy of teaching and of learning.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair.
Well, I'm on board with the philosophy, but I am thinking about the teachers that may be listening to this right now and still thinking, okay, but what does ungrading actually look like in practice? Does your feedback look like a descriptor would look on a rubric? Or how do students know how they're being measured? Like, how do they know that they're successful? Is there a standard for that? Or is that too formal? Is that going against what ungrading stands for?
If you're getting rid of letters and numbers, then it's even more important to give quality feedback. I think a rubric is a nice way to be clear about what you're going to evaluate and can help you give assessment. So I would say like a rubric with comments is a good way to go. Like I said, I'm still very much exploring this myself. So I've only done a few things with ungrading. My first like venture into it were the listening and speaking courses that I teach here at Mission.
Remember, listeners, Albert works as an ESL faculty member at Mission College in Santa Clara, California.
And so what I started doing wasn't technically ungrading, but I gave the students a little more power over their assessment. What we did is students would give 3 presentations during the semester. Okay, so for our first presentation, instead of me deciding on the rubric, I had us make the rubric as a class.
I love that.
So we talked about the value of feedback. You know, we did a whole like lesson. It was a whole class. We brainstormed different aspects of the presentation we could receive feedback on. And then students in teams decided what they wanted to give feedback on. And then we voted as a class. We used, I think, Poll Everywhere for the vote. And then the next presentation, we took it a step farther and the students made their own individual rubrics. And so they were all getting assessed the way they wanted to get assessed. But then I looked at this course that I'm teaching for NeoScholar.
For NeoScholar, Albert teaches virtually at a large university in Wuhan, China, with huge lecture halls of students.
And this is a very different setup than what I'm used to.
Mm.
So for the course, there's me, the professor, and there's a team of teachers that are working with students in different classrooms or review groups and doing the actual grading. So I wanted to, again, be equitable. So I thought, well, this would be a great opportunity to try going gradeless. Now, these students at the end of the semester, like most of our classes, are going to receive a letter, A, B, C, D, or F. So what I did was we divided the course into two sets of grades, writing assignments and tests. There's 3 writing assignments. First 2 are paragraphs and the third one is an essay. And then there's 3 tests. So in order to get an A in the class, you have to simply get a pass in each writing assignment and get a pass in each test. So for the writing assignments, that means that you write the paragraph, the teacher grades it with a rubric, they give it back to you. You look at the rubric, you look at the teacher's comments, you look at their editing symbols, you rewrite the paragraph. The teacher will look at it again. They'll leave you notes about where you improved, where you're still struggling. If your paragraph is good enough, if it meets, a certain standard based on the rubric, you receive a pass. If it doesn't, you get it again. You get a chance to write it over. And, you might write it like 4 times. So that gives you a chance. It promotes growth, but it also, you're not focused on your score because there is no score. You're just focused on the feedback you're getting and improving based on the feedback you're getting. So that was the easy part. The tests is what I struggled with. I was like, how do you do this with a test? So we tried a couple different things, a couple different ideas. And what we came up with was students would take a test, and if they got 75% of the test right, they would get a pass. If they didn't get 75% right, well, first, after they take the test, the teacher would mark it, but not give them the correct answers. Instead, the students would work in groups and help each other kind of figure out the correct answers. The students who didn't receive a 75 will have a chance to write a reflection talking about what they got wrong, how they understand the grammar point or whatever it be. And if they write a good reflection, then they also get the pass. So it's really just the whole thing is just based on making mistakes is good because it gives you an opportunity to learn. So learning from your mistakes and knowing what you're doing well.
I love the examples you just gave because you're also sort of demonstrating the differences in how you might implement these principles within the institutional constraints that you're working in. Because oh my gosh, yes, you have to have a test, right? You have to have, X, Y, Z.
In China, you do.
Right. It's necessary. I mean, the fact that you're implementing this, though, in that context means there is that space for it, and you can find a creative way to bring in that reflective piece and focus on the learning and not so much the number in a variety of different ways. That's really quite creative. I appreciate that.
Thanks. I'm really glad you brought that up, the institutional constraints, because we all have them. And that's all true. But on top of that, remember, this is also what the students are used to, right? They're used to getting grades. They're used to, getting 80s and 90s and hundreds. So if you just throw that all out, it's not just the school that might come after you, the students might revolt too.
Yeah, discombobulated. Yeah.
And so, Albert, have you heard any sort of feedback from the students or even the teachers that you're working with on implementing this ungrading in that context? What have their reactions been so far?
So there's a few things I've noticed so far. First, the most important thing is to get buy-in from the students. Okay, as I was kind of saying, you want the students to understand what you're doing because it's probably very, very different to them. And you want them to really be invested into it. And you also want them to understand that it doesn't mean easier. It might be less stressful, but also more rigorous. I think that's the goal. In addition to the rubrics, I had the students write and record reflections after their presentations and at the end of each section of that listening and speaking course. And so far, I found that they're asking better questions than they would in class. It seems like they're thinking about the material.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I love that distinction there. less stressful, but more rigorous.
And the emphasis on reflection. Even though this format may seem weird at the beginning, students are buying into it. They're really digging into the material and focusing on learning rather than grades.
Yeah. But beyond student buy-in, there's also institutional buy-in.
They're asking for a grade. You know, the administration is asking for a grade at the end of the semester. You, of course, should, follow your syllabus and achieve certain outcomes. But within that, I think it's worth investigating how much freedom you have.
Yeah.
And then what you could do with that freedom.
This is just so interesting. In so many cases, we have to grade. We have to have a grade, a certain number of grades collected over the course of the school term.
But that doesn't mean we can't infuse this philosophy, this approach into our work. It really seems to be about making a commitment to alternative assessment practices and finding creativity within our constraints.
And it really seems to pay off.
Maybe tell us a little bit more about some of the benefits that you haven't mentioned, and how are you going to get your colleagues to try this out, Albert?
Well, I think the first benefit is it encourages a growth mindset.
Oh, Shey's loving you right now.
Carol Dweck! I try to sneak it into an episode every 3 episodes. Okay, all right, well.
Every episode.
All right, okay.
She tries to sneak it into anything. Yeah, but you snuck it in this time. Growth mindset. Yes. Sorry, continue, Albert.
No, excellent. I find her name comes up a lot in education, but it's true. I think for my colleagues, at least, that's something that they're interested in. I think a lot of us in the field are now. And I just think it encourages students to take chances. We're not lowering their grade because they tried in writing, say, they tried a different structure that got all convoluted. We're not judging them in the same way. We're encouraging them to take chances, giving them opportunities to work through those chances and stuff.
Yeah, and it's a greater life lesson too, right? Risk taking and being brave, being daring. It transcends the classroom. And I think that's important. That's a big part of the work we do.
And I love that word judging that you just used. I hadn't really thought of grading and traditional assessment in this sense of judging and the fear of judgment that comes out of that. I'm glad you used that word, because I think that removing that fear of judgment is just
key. It's key.
I like that.
Yeah. We're giggling at our use of the word key, Albert, because we say it so much and we try to come up with synonyms, but sometimes there's just no better word.
Well, it's part of your brand,
Yeah, that and Carol Dweck, apparently.
Oh, we're pretty ridiculous, Anna.
That's what happens when you put the two of us on a Zoom call together talking about teaching.
Can't stay serious for too long.
But as our final question, we asked Albert what resources he would recommend for teachers who are considering infusing some of these ideas into their classroom assessment and grading practices.
A starter kit for equitable assessment, if you will.
So earlier in our talk, I mentioned Sarah Bloom ungrading in the pandemic and the rest of the time. I think that's a good starting point. You can find that on SoundCloud. And then she's also edited a book called Ungrading: Why Rating Students Undermines Learning and What to Do Instead. One of the essays in there, a guy named Jesse Stommel, who I mentioned earlier, he has a blog that has a lot on ungrading and alternative aspects of grading. Joe Feldman, he has a book called Grading for Equity. And then finally, Zaretta Hammond's Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. Because if you want to be equitable in teaching and guide students to participate in active learning and critical thinking, I think employing a culturally responsive teaching practice is very important.
We'll link all of these in the show notes, friends.
So that's it, listeners. We want to hear from you. What equitable forms of assessment have you introduced in your classroom? Has our conversation with Albert inspired you to try anything new?
How can you find creative ways to bring this spirit of equity to your classroom assessment?
We hope you've enjoyed our focus on assessment in the past few months. This conversation with Albert was truly the cherry on top.
And wow, Anna, this is our last episode before we take our winter break, isn't it?
Yeah, almost. We have a fun little surprise. Well, mean, it's not a surprise. We did it last
No.
year too.
And you just told them.
All right. It's not a surprise. But our 2022 blooper reel will be coming out right before the new year.
Yeah, we hope you'll listen in for some fun.
And then we'll be back in February with an awesome kickoff event. Remember, we've been gathering responses for our Friends of the Podcast episode, and drum roll. Friends of the Podcast won't just be any other episode. We'll be recording video content with it.
Yeah, so you can see just how dorky we are and watch us make fools of ourselves on video while listening to all of the wonderful responses we collected from listeners around the world.
Yes, so if you want to be featured on this special episode, check out the questions we posted on social media and leave us a short voice message with your answers on our Friends of the Podcast WhatsApp chat at bit.ly/pod_friends.
And if WhatsApp isn't for you, you can also email us at teacherthinkaloud@gmail.com or write to us on social media. We're so eager to learn about you, members of this community of practice.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Teacher Think Aloud podcast. And until next time, happy teaching
And happy reflecting.